Hello and aloha. In this video, I'm going to talk about creating new times and seasons, and it starts with a calendar. I was working on some other stuff this week, and I got just in my brain this, you got to work on this, and so I spent 4 or 5 hours that day working on it, and I kind of figured it out. And then the next day I realized, oh, it was July 14th. Aloha to my friends of, I want to say Galicia, Francia, the Franks. That's not the name of that place. Viva la République. I don't speak French, so. So I guess they were the ones that came up with the first calendars that would go in garages of men. We should just adopt their calendar just for this, should we not? Nothing like a beautiful woman. So in the modern era, the one attempt at a true republic came from the French. It lasted about 12 years. And part of what they wanted to do was separate themselves from the great and abominable church, which they defined to be any institution of man. The Rousseau-Locke thing was a problem. They created the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. You know, the liberals around the world are wanting us to come up with new such rights, the rights to, I like what Jefferson said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This country we tried, but this is where we failed. And I think Jefferson knew he failed. I really do. He had a lot of property. He had a lot of slaves. He had children with at least one slave. But he was trapped under credit. And the collateral he had was his property and his slaves. And he was in chains. He was enslaved by the system of his day. And, what a great line that is. But the failure of this corporation. And so the French, it only lasted 12 years because they were dreamy-eyed. They could, in the world they lived in, they couldn't implement it. You have to change the paradigm if you want to go that way. And this was the failure. And, the Glenn Becks of the world are going to say, well, they had to compromise. There were 13 colonies, and 2 of the 13, Georgia and Carolina, just wouldn't accept it. Well, then they're called sissy men. You can't have it both ways. You can't go all Noel Reynolds on me and tell me how great the American Constitution was and Federalist Papers were if they couldn't convince 2 more colonies. But George Washington was the greatest. Well, he was shooting blanks. He married a widow. He became very wealthy because of it. When he ran his property, things worked smooth. He was a very good manager. When he was away at war, he had to constantly send her money home. He was enslaved to the widow he married. He received like a third of her dowry. But he would switch up which crops he was growing because they just lived beyond their means. And when he died, he had all these papers, and he gave them to his nephew or something. And his nephew was supposed to take care of them. His wife comes by and burns a bunch of them, a bunch of her letters. So she thought she owned her letters. And it was probably about her always asking for money. And then another guy comes by and burns a bunch of his letters. I'm trying to remember who that was. I think it was James Madison. Okay, so when you burn books of any type to hide what was really going on, you're not a man. You're a sissy man. Did George Washington have a vision at Valley Forge? I don't know. The story that one author tells of Valley Forge, where he tries to, come on, man, stick around, please stay, and it doesn't work, and so then he quotes Shakespeare or something, and he gets him to stay. I'm trying to remember who wrote that book, but anyway, that was a nice book. There was a document saying, "We the people, Amin Adi, we want our rights." It sounds like Title of Liberty. But they failed. They failed miserably. And who signed the document the biggest? John Hancock. Might be Herbie Hancock. But he was from the North. He wasn't married to a widow. He wasn't burdened with debt. Whoever they are couldn't control him. Well, we need someone from the South, and George Washington's really rich, and he can get along with the people from... So this is what politics is. This is the natural man, the philosophies of men. Rousseau versus Locke. You got to lock them down, Locke said. Can't be trusted. No, you have to create levels of management and order, and if it gets too big, it gets out of control. I think the captains of 10, 50, 100, and 1,000 is an important lesson. Imagine a town that only has 10 families in it, or a subunit of a town. And 5 of those subunits make up a smaller subunit of a town. And then you go up and you work. The more layers you have could create inefficiencies, but inefficiencies in liberty are important. So one of our great failures in this country were, that was the great failure, but then was the Bill of Rights. We had to come up with the Bill of Rights later. Freedom of religion, freedom whatever. The first 10 were probably good. They probably should have been included in the original Constitution. Everyone after it is the philosophies of men messing with things. You have no rights across state lines. States' rights. The vice president being the runner-up of the presidential election. It requires the 2 wings of the same bird to work together. Abolishes slavery. That should have been the Declaration of Independence. Oh, due process. We don't even have due process. Asset foreclosure or forfeiture. You have to prove to us where this asset came from. Part of the right to vote, race, color. Well, you should have solved that with the Constitution. Income tax. In ancient times, look at your hands. You got 2 thumbs. So a typical tax was a 1-thumb tax, a tithing, 1 out of 10. You read the Book of Mormon, King Noah wants the tax 2 out of 10. Those were the 2 taxes. This Revolutionary War, I believe, was fought over a tax of 0.5%. And then they snuck this in. What this did is it shifted the balance of power from the states to the federal government, the power of the purse. I'm going to get in trouble for the 19th Amendment. These are men sitting around bickering. Why should women want to be participating with that? Women need to create their own cameral house and government based on how they would do it, based on how their protocols would work. And I shouldn't dictate what that is. The women's government should be the government of what should be done. And the men's government should be that's man's work, go do it. So, putting it in the bicameral house, the women would be the house, they control the purse strings. The men would be the Senate where they sit and bicker. Oh, look what this did, the 17th Amendment. The direct election of senators by popular vote. Every time you have an electoral college, you reduce mobocracy. I just think of Joseph Smith hanging out with all of his buddies, sitting there chit-chatting about this and that all the time, where the women are doing all the work. I remember the Whitmer family, the mom's out milking the cow. She's got all these guests. She's got to take care of all of them because they're just men doing their thing. And she was probably the first witness of the plates of the legend of Nephi. It was her benefit. There's no sexism here, but this was a failure. So I believe under the law of this slavery law, the 13th Amendment, I believe this is where the nature of corporations came about. One of these laws tied to this. So corporations back in the day, you would have a project, you would incorporate. When the project was over, you would dissolve in less than a year. And now we have this idea, according to the Supreme Court, that corporations have personhood. So they can go on TV and say they empower women when they're paying the women $1 an hour in China to build a shoe. That's Nike versus Kasky. That's the world we live in. Thanks to these ridiculous places. The District of Columbia, taxation without representation. I think that's interesting. It just tells you how big this place has gotten, how many people live there, how much money is flowing through there. Succession to the presidency, potential disabilities. It's such a game. It's such a game. So anyway, the best chance was this, but if you read this, and if I were to do an analysis of this was not written by Jefferson, even though he contributed. It was clearly he was working with a man that also had his own views of things, which was Lafayette. And it was a good pass, and there's a lot of argument of what it could have been and whatever, but they had their chance, and part of their chance was a calendar. I'd really like to read the original thoughts, if I could get it transliterated, of the guy that came up with this calendar. It was pretty good. And so anyway, the question that's posed is, can you reform the calendar that's better than the Gregorian? So the Gregorian calendar, so the first question is, should you do the Nazarah calendar? So let me pull up that. It's a Persian New Year. Nowruz. I don't know how to pronounce anything. So what they do is they go and observe the actual spring equinox. And this is the same problem with the lunar calendars. You have to go and observe it from a certain point in time. And it has its benefit if the heavens and earth move out of their place, which from Isaiah we know may happen. In terms of record keeping on this earth, it's not a good idea, because it's going to constantly create a little bit of a shift that is a function of knowing what they observed on that day, and if it was cloudy or whatever, there's a problem. You can't use a calculated calendar. Calendar may come from calculated, and an observed calendar to keep records. You have to use a calculated calendar. And then you can make observations about actual versus observed. And, that's the fundamental basis of the Gregorian calendar. And so the Gregorian calendar, has these rules defined as every year that is divisible by 4 is a leap year, except for years that are exactly divisible by 100. But these centuries are leap years if they're exactly divisible by 400. And so what they were doing is they were trying to get to the true tropical year, the solar year, by calculation. And it's called the ephemeral or something. So we have 360 degrees in a circle, but we believe that we always had 365.25 days in a year. Okay, keep telling yourself that. So for those astrophysicists out there, I have a planet that is now the inner asteroid belt. What is its mass? They say it could have at one time been a small planet. Yeah, maybe. Maybe. Could some of its debris crashed into other planets and is gone? So one, where was it? Where was its orbit? We're supposed to believe somehow that the moon spun off from the Earth to create itself, which may or may not have happened, but that's kind of the astrophysics explanation. But it's a billiards problem. So now let's say I have another planet somewhere between Mars and Earth or wherever that asteroid belt is. We know its mass. It collides with the moon in such a way, well, it collides with the moon and or the Earth in such a way that the orbits of the Earth, so let's assume the Earth and the moon had a perfect orbit. And let's assume a 360-degree orbit was a 360-degree solar year exactly. So, what would its angular momentum be, its rotation be, for it to be that distance from the sun in a perfectly circular orbit? So we have a really nice orbit, but I forget the term, the AU or whatever. And then let's imagine the moon had a perfect orbit of 30 days, perfectly. And now imagine, so for whatever reason, the angular velocity of the moon and the Earth are the same, that we think the moon is standing still, so we see the man in the moon. And in South America, you see the conejo in the moon. Looks like a bunny rabbit or something. And the ancient Indians talked about the dark side of the moon, the black moon. And there's some people that talk about there might be some crystalline structures on the dark side of the moon. But I've envisioned if the moon was moving at a different angular velocity of its rotation, you could possibly have this yin and yang look going on. Like if it has a dark side and a white side, plus light and dark of the moon phases. So imagine you got this rotating orb that kind of looks like a yin and yang. And so it's spinning at a different rate. So we have this ratio of the size of the moon from the distance to the moon with the sun, and that creates our eclipses. What would an eclipse look like in a 360-day orbit with a 30-day moon orbit? And, and I'm suggesting that there is some, maybe like every 5 days or something. There is some angular momentum of the moon, and I intentionally say 5 or 10 days because that's kind of the thesis here. Look at your hands, 5 days, maybe 10 days, that you've got this yin and yang thing going on, plus you've got the light thing going on in the heavens. So anyway, then in statistics, we have in physics, we have what are called significant digits. So this Ephemeran days is a thing kind of coming from NASA. And this is kind of the target. And assuming that's the target. And all the calculations I've done for the solar eclipses and stuff is based and anchored to this. And if you look at the footnotes, one of the footnotes is from this Muse guy. Not there. Yeah. And so it changes every year, but there's an average. And that's how the Gregorian calendar works. So it changes every year, there's an average. And so this is the rules. And these rules were basically modifications from the previous rules. So divide by 4 was their first solution. So I look at my hands, I'm like, why are you dividing by 4? I look at the decimal system, I'm like, why are you dividing by 4? I look at the French trying to decimize things. Like, why are you dividing by 4? So let's build a calendar where you divide by 5. It's very easy to do that division, even for people that don't know math. So there are some features you need for a calendar. How you divide them, etc., how you take care of leap years. And so the ancient Egyptians created epigeminal days or whatever, intercalendary days outside of the months. And I don't know exactly when and how they placed them. The Mayan calendar, from my understanding, called those days the chaos days. So are those days celebration or chaos? So imagine one planet hitting another planet. There's chaos, but there could be celebration depending on which team you're on. So because the sun and the moon are out of whack, you're not going to be able to perfectly achieve all of these objectives. But you can't achieve the moon objective yet. Just imagine if the whole world celebrated Earth Day or celebration days together, the entire world. Remember all these movies where everyone's praying because a big comet's coming? Imagine if we sat and all prayed at the same time in our own faiths, in our own religions, and we asked for the heavens to be restored. Imagine if, and so part of the design of the calendar I have is it could allow for that restoration. And then the moon would align with the sun. Genesis chapter 1, the greater light shall rule the day, the lesser light should rule the night. Your calendar should be based on the sun. Amun-Ra, the sun. So these are the criteria. I can do everything except tying it to the lunar phase with the number 5. And that's what I did the other day. So the Egyptian calendar, they had what are called decans. It was supposedly tied to something going on in the stars so they could see them. They only have 3 seasons, which is correct. There are 4 epochs of a year. We divide the equinoxes and the solstices. Those are epochs. Those are dividing time. Those are not seasons. Days and years have seasons. They're in multiples or divisions of 3. 3 is related to divinity. And yes, it's not 5. It's not on my hands, so I must be a hypocrite. They don't know all the names of the decans, supposedly. I think we do. So then they have what are called pentads, which would be 5 days. And 5 days together make a decan or a decad. We would call that a week, or we'd have to come up with a word for it because week means 7. Samana comes from 7. Samana may come from 8 if you read the Hebrew. And so there you have it. You have your clockwork. The ancient Chinese had a calendar like this with 360 days, that then they dealt with the extra days. They've had 4 or 5 different calendars. And in those days, they basically said a man had to bathe himself one every 5 days. When the emperor of China, or whatever he called himself, found out that Yeshua had died with the solar eclipse, it said he left his business for 5 days. Not 3 days, not 10 days, 5 days. So this idea of a pentad is a smaller idea. And one of the things I've thought about as I look at my hands is we got Monday through Friday, left hand, times gender, Monday/Friday. Left hand is the female, right hand is the male. Male/female, M-/F, M-F, gives you 10 days in a week. And, I thought about that some time ago. So I guess this epigerial intercalary calendar sounds like calculate. You put some days in between. So I'm going to walk through what I've come up with. French calendar, and then we'll move on to that. So the rules are simple. If the year is divisible by 5, you get an extra day. The year is divisible by 25, you get an extra day. Because it's divisible by 5 and 25, you get 2 extra days. Every 5 years, you get an extra day. Every 25 years, you get 2 extra days. Every 500 years, you get 3 extra days. Every 5,000 years, you get 4 extra days. So we're not adding and subtracting. So the fractional math is you're trying to get to this fraction, which is an average. So it varies. And, you could try to do it as an infinite sum, but this is what we currently have. So we have every 4 years, and then except for means minus, meaning you don't get a new year. And then every 400 years, you do get a year. And then some guys actually propose the minus 400. So this shows you the margin of error, the deviation of error from this average factor. And so, if you also did this 16,000, which I came up with, notice 2.5 e to the 6 is smaller than that, so it's more accurate. But this is based on an average, and this only has 5 significant digits, so you're kind of getting carried away. So this is the current rule. This rule is being suggested because there's a problem with the current rule. So the current rule is called the Gregorian. I'm thinking about calling mine the Alexandrian or the Zellian, which is Alexander spelled backwards, Zella. So this gray one is the current system, and this yellow one is mine. So in the short term, you can see that there are some variations, and it's tied to some sort of average. In the long term, and so some of you are saying, well, why don't you just always correct it once in a while if there's a problem? That's the problem. It has to be a calculation, because if it's a calculation, it's fixed time on Earth. It doesn't change. If other things around it changes, you can make adjustments, but you have something that's always going tick, tock, always by the same rules. So we have all these lost days between the Gregorian and the Julian calendar. We just rewind and we can map them. We can say on this calendar, this is the date, but you have to have a tick tock that's unchanging. So you're going to notice mine always comes back to 0. It corrects itself back to 0 every 5,000 years. This one is wandering. This is the Gregorian. And that's why they want to do the 4,000 calculation to help with the wandering. But it's still going to wander because it's not perfectly to that fraction. So we're assuming that fraction doesn't change over time, which it might. But the idea is if you create these rules and things change, you can, like if we somehow went to a 360-day year, whatever, I think we'd want to reset time. But meaning the sun and the moon moved to a place where it was a 360-day year. I don't think, this is based on the idea that we've always been in the same place. When we go back and look at history in the last, 5,000 years, it's always been rotating about the same. This is where we come up with all of our calculations for eclipses and lunar data, for full moons, for lunar eclipses, and it's all anchored to the same guy at NASA. This is Mayus and his fraction of 0.2419. So maybe the Gregorian calendar. So I could shift a first day to kind of offset the calendar, and what that would do is that would shift my hovering where it's mean centered to 0. And so the range would be it's either off by -2 days or off by 1 day. That's the range of its min to max. And in the short term, you can see the range, the Gregorian calendar outperforms mine. But we're talking about being off by a quarter of a day. In the long term, mine outperforms significantly the Gregorian. Mine's based on the number 5. You're always adding more days. So you get bonus days. 5, 5 squared, 500, 5,000. I prefer setting this clock because then you can set it to a time in the past as time 0. You don't have to set it to now and say, oh, we did the adjustment now. I can actually say, let's look at March 21st, 2020 as the spring equinox. Based on that, I can go on the cycles. I can go all the way back into time. And I can anchor it back all the way back into time, so I don't have to call 2020 year 0. I can call 2020 something close to 2020, like 2027 or something. So there's my range. So if you look at mine, there's my margin there. So that's where I'm at. That's where that's at. You know, I can tweak it a little bit more to get exactly there with this 100,000 year rule. But that's a minus. Notice all of mine are plus. So that's why I don't like that idea. And then I played around with like a 600 year cycle and 1800 year cycle. And the thing is every time you add another fractionary element, your deviation should be smaller. So that's smaller, smaller, smaller. 0.04, 0002, or 002, 0005, and 3. So this one would work. But why are you all of a sudden going from 5 to 600 instead of 500 here? These are all clearly tied to number 5. You know, and some of it's tied to Mormonism, right? We had the 600-year prophecy. We got Muhammad. So if you put a big plus or minus, you got Yeshua at time 0. The birth of Yeshua. You got the birth of Jacob, the Nephite story, at 600 years before the birth of Yeshua. Some of the signs in heaven were similar. You got Muhammad, which, if we believe the histories, would have been 23-ish about this time. You've got this Mughal calendar out of India that's anchored exactly 600 years to this frame, for whatever reason. Muhammad, when he was 40, had his first vision, I think. And then he had his trip to Mecca. Mecca. Then he had his trip to Jerusalem. You know, you draw a line from Jerusalem to Mecca. He traveled through the same mountain where Moses was, and Joshua, and Jacob, and likely the transfiguration of Yeshua. And so, do I believe Muhammad was a prophet? Absolutely. Do I know exactly the histories and the dates? No, there's a lot of ambiguity. So what was he doing according to what we know about Muhammad when he was 23 years old? That's what I want to know. Did he have a son when he was 23 years old? And who was that son? What was his name? You know, those things would interest me. Okay, so there's no times and seasons. And then when do I want to start the clock? So I can start it now and rewind as far back as I want, because the oscillation is perfect if we assume this average rotation is correct. This is always restoring itself back to the exact same number, 0.05, you know, with a very slight noise, I guess. And so then I spent some time thinking about what the months would be, how you would divide it up. And I think you'd start with women, ladies first, left side, strong side. You would count contiguously. If you look at your hand, you can count with your pointer finger, which is very American, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where the thumb is last.
But if you were to count contiguously, you would put your thumb out first as one. We don't do that because we have thumbs up, thumbs down. You know, the gladiator, thumbs up, thumbs down. Thumbs down as you die, thumbs up as you're living. What is that? What? Thumb pointing up to heaven. Send the gladiator to heaven. Thumb pointing down. Send them to earth. Which one's killed that? So anyway, the thumb is obviously a separate finger. It's what makes us human. So it is the likeness of God. It is the God finger. It's got to be holy and sacred. And then you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember that Escalante saying, "I mean, your book." He would teach them, like how to multiply by nines. In India, they teach the children how to multiply by all the numbers with the fingers as they can. And, we have power with the casting of the nines with 10 hands. You have your hands. You can always teach with your hands. The number 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What day is it? It's left hand middle finger. And then we would assign it to mother. I think I've changed this out. But you could assign it generically and then let people in their own religions and faith choose the name. So you have female mother, male father, female daughter, male son, every 5 days. Female all mother, female, male all father, grandparents. And then I thought about that, and I think I would start the month with the all mother, and then the all father, and then the mother and father and daughter and son, and I would cycle that way. Because the all mother and the all father create the mother and the father. The mother and the father create the daughter and the son, and then the month is over. And then you start another month. So I've kind of changed some of my thinking there. And then, who are these names and what names would you give them? And it's a universal time, but it's got an abstraction, so you can apply your faith and traditions of your fathers to it. So if you want, like I was thinking, if the whole world would take the first month off and call it a holiday, you've got these days that are ending the year, that's anywhere from 5 to 9 extra days, and then you've got 30 days off. The whole world is doing that same thing. The whole world just stops for 30 days. And they reflect in their religions. Just imagine how much good could happen there. So if we start the clock with Yeshua, so Yeshua was likely born April 5th, 8 BC. I'm not setting that as time 0. I'm setting the equinox as time 0. And this is why I thought through it. Yeshua as Yael would be the 16th, which would be the 16th of the month, which is Nisan 14 or 15 in their lunar version of this. And he would represent the Father. So he came from an all-Father. He is the Father. He has his children, the sons and daughters of Christ, which become the sons and daughters of the All-Father. So, I've thought through a little bit about that. 600 years on the clock is Muhammad, 23. We got the Crusades in 1200. And we just happen to have the Republic of France and their calendar that falls on that cycle, which is pretty amazing. We got Jacob, Nephi's brother, the Shazer event. We got probably Joshua, Ephraim, the high priesthood. So Moses and the Levites had the Aaronic, Levitical priesthood. Joshua was giving the high priesthood. There were 2 priesthoods in ancient Israel, for sure, maybe 3. We got Abraham, maybe. Abraham could be up here. But for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we got Abraham, We got Abraham's firstborn son through Muhammad. Jacob had two branches, Ephraim and Manasseh. So I'm asking, where's the Midians in this calculation? And the Midians could be possibly tied to the middle calendar. I don't know. You've got to give Ishmael one of these cycles. It's very important based on the Abrahamic covenant. And what about Reuben, the firstborn? Where is he in this mix? And then I did 500-year cycles, and 500 years to the day on my calendar, Columbus arrived to the day, meaning within a month. Columbus returns to Spain. He apparently, because of the bad weather, he lands in Portugal and gets in trouble, and he finally returns to port in Spain. And if I recall, they took the Santa Maria in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean with the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria. 75 men. They returned with a few slaves to the ships. There's some question about them leaving the men behind. I think two of the ships got separated. I think one of the ships, if you read the story, one of the ships, they were just going off to islands to rape women. And they just left Columbus behind. Columbus was on the main ship, and he got attacked by a superior navy, Marani. They lost their ship. They said, oh, we left our 38 men behind to repair the ship. They were getting shot at the day before in his journal. And then they said they lost the ship. They're going to leave 38 men behind with a bunch of arrow shooting at the boats on the same island where they had skirmish the night before. So that whole history is sanitized. He had Bartolomé de las Casas write the edited version of his journal. He noticed they were circumcised. Circumcision wasn't a thing in the Catholic Church. He was likely, his children didn't know where he was from. Cristobal Colon was probably Cristobal Colon. He was very likely Catalan from the Barcelona era. The Colon or Corom, the R and L get interchanged in history sometimes. Family in Barcelona revolted. He was Jewish, a man among Gentiles. He was a man. For Nephi to say he was a man, Nephi was equating with him. He's a man like me among the Gentiles, not me. He noticed they were circumcised. Yeah, they're running around naked. So they'd have this little waist thing around their collar, a little string around their waist, and they'd have some sort of thing so they could tie their ding-dong to the string so they could run without it interrupting them. They were naked. The women had the same thing. They'd have a little string around their waist, and they didn't have a hair on their body except on their head. I'm pretty sure they still had hair on their head. And you wonder why so many men volunteered to go back. Anyway, he gets to America, or back to Spain. 75 went, 38 were lost, so we got 38 coming back. They captured a few women, so they had some fun on the ship coming back, and they could learn the language. There was a universal language, the old Tupi language. And so if they learned that language, they could communicate with all these Indians, because the Indians had their own languages, but they could all speak this old Tupi language. They get back, he gets with the king or queen, they return. They return, I believe, with 1,500 men. I don't remember how many ships. They never found
that group that attacked them. They went in the second voyage. The doctor wrote his own journal, so we didn't get it obfuscated. Columbus's journal was obfuscated by Bartolomé de las Casas. Columbus was paying another priest in northern Italy to write a story about the Crusades in Jerusalem and all that from a Christian perspective. So the Queen of England and Ferdinand would accept him as a Christian because he was a Jew. So he was playing politics. And maybe he converted, that's fine. But he was a Jew. He was a man among the Gentiles. It's the wheat among the tares. It's not the wheat among the wheat. It's not he was a subset of the Gentiles. He was a man among the Gentiles. He was intermixed with them. And Colombia, the They knew his name. Nephi was playing with his children. He's writing, if you read First Nephi, he tells the name of certain people and not of other people. So he could go to any village he was visiting with his children and say, oh, let's just read this tonight. And sometimes he would give the name. The name of that person was John. And sometimes he would say the man among the Gentiles, and then he would ask the question to his children, what's the name? So there is this dark Dostoevsky kind of thing going on, that you know your people are going to die, and you're going to die by this man named Colombia or Colombia. And it's Cologne or Corom, Imbia, Mia, Imbia, arrival, landing. So it might not mean that. Based on my current knowledge, that's what my intuition is telling me. It might mean something completely different. But somehow, there's a couple things. Somehow the Germans tell stories. So one of the German stories is, we were talking to the locals, and this is on, several voyages later or whatever, and they're starting to send back all these pictures. We're talking to the locals, and they're like, oh yeah, we know about Yeshua and your apostles. Well, what do you know? And the Indians tell them, that's blasphemy. And they tie them all up, hang them all, and burn them all. And that's what the etching and drawing is. What they said about Yeshua and the apostles was blasphemous, that they killed all the people that said that. That tells us we don't know what really happened to Yeshua and the apostles. That information went to Germany. There's a group of European Jews called the Ashkenazis, the Nazis. There's a group of Jews called Nazis. Nazi means Nazir, which is the consecrated ones, the Nazarenes. The Germans have some sort of information, and they use that information. They have eugenics, and I don't have any doubt that they were killing Christians, they were killing disabled people, and they were killing Jews. The best book to read on this is A Man's Search for Meaning by Frankl. He lived among them, and he said many of the best of us went into the chamber with the Lord's Prayer, which is a Christian prayer, or the Shalom Alakra Shalama, whatever I don't know the Jewish prayer, on their lips. And he talked about how you would anchor to love, to live, and you would play all these games not to go to the chamber that day. It's a really interesting book. But how does a nation of Nazis decide they're going to go and kill all of the Jews? And tie that back to what I just said. What did they read about what the Jews actually did to Yeshua that would get them to do that? And we talk about the Jewish Holocaust. The American Holocaust of the colonistas was possibly 30 million or 100 million. It was disease. Okay, you can tell yourself that. They likely killed as much protein in the wilderness as they could just for sport, like the Americans did later with the bison and the salmon in the Northwest, to limit the abilities of the Indians to live their own lives. You take the protein, then you can control them. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. 1993, we got cold fusion going on. We got superconductivity going on. We got these stories, anniversaries of Joan of Arc and some others. I don't know what 1993 would be, but on that cycle. But anyway, I did this on Bastille Day. So I think I'm just going to fly through this. The ox, the symbol for the ox, the water ox, the symbols of Amet, which is truth in Hebrew. In the Old Hebrew is an ox head, picture of water, and the cross. The water ox. the beginning and the end. The Alpha and the Omega is the Alpha and the Tav, which is an ox and a cross with water in between. And so I looked up the words for water. That doesn't look like an old word because that doesn't look like water. Rain looks like water when you look at the picture. Milk was interesting because that looks like a B, which is town or city. But when you looked at it closely into the details, it wasn't. River, you got an old version of water coming from the side there. The number 10, which is the cross, which is the number 10, the cross sign, is the same as the Tav sign in Hebrew. And some ancient people were, ancient Egyptologists, philologists in the 1800s were trying to make a connection with China and Chinese because they didn't speak it at the time. And then you got garden. Garden has a cross in there. And so I looked all that up. You can go decompose each letter. So this is water. This tells me this is kind of a new word because you look at its. We have to eventually put it in order. This looks like rain. So you got a firmament. You got a firmament element. So you got the heavens, the firmament, and rain. You got this upside down thing, which is the batim or the house. The upside down, sometimes it's a square root symbol in the Chinese. This is water with some other words. This looks like water. Look at that one. Rain looks like water. So there's just water. And this is water, cow. This is milk. Cow plus woman bent. So this looked like town, but it's not. The woman is correct. There's two forms of woman and human. So this is a woman with something up above, which means there's a tie to heaven. But this B kind of looks like the Shah turned sideways in the development of the Paleo-Hebrew language. So I believe APC or -7 would be a good year to start the clock. For some reason in the Bengali calendar, they have that 600-year thing going on there. It's always the shift from the water rat to the water ox. So by the solstice, it's always the water ox. The lunar calendar shifts by quite a bit, but we're talking late January to mid-February is when the Chinese calendar changes. So you start the clock there. This is the water rat. The water rat looks like jade. This is the same symbol for jade, so it might actually be. So you've got the cross, which is kind of the mid-heaven. It's like middle earth. You got the heavens, and you got the ground, earth. Jade means king or queen, priest or priestess. It's the green-blue color in the Chinese, jade, the symbol. This symbol is supposed to be scholar. Scholar looks like the plus or minus sign. The plus is 10. Let's see if I have more. The water. Child. It's not a child, it's a seed or an egg. So that makes me think of the serpent mound. The head of the serpent mound looks like an egg, semen. And then we got this generic thing. So you got this little curl with the big T. That looks the same as what we'll see an ox looks like. Because that kind of looks like an ox. We've got a plus sign. We got all sorts of things going on. It means year. Bend 110. We got a right square, and we got a vertical line. Vertical lines to me is a connection to heaven somehow. Bend, I'm going around the earth one time. Somehow there's a number 10 associated with it. 10 to me is middle earth. It's heaven up and down. Horizontal means across. It's kind of like this phase. We got the square, which we need to figure out more about, and we got that. So then you decompose the scholar, and the scholar will decompose That's the number 1. That's the number 10. But the 1 is on the ground. And 10 is a function of 1 and 10. So that shouldn't surprise me. So this is the water ox. It doesn't say water. Footsteps, 1 big. So notice we have the crossing motion, but now it's 2 legs, the man and the woman. So this is a healthy man and a woman, not a divided man or woman, or not one carrying the other. Maybe Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. Maybe it wasn't Eve. I have a hard time going that far, but it's possible. So if you look at this, we got above, below, and mid. The firmament, heavens above, the earth below, and middle earth. But we got a different shape. It's knife, and it's the number 2. And this is assuming that's the correct interpretation of that glyph. I would want to catalog all the glyphs by history and date and time on their use, and then start to rethink some of this. Not carrying a double-edged sword, but carrying 2 knives, possibly. It could be double-edged sword. So it could be 2 machetes. The year of the ox. So again, we got this symbol that looks like a big T with a little ox horn there. And that means year. So it wasn't water. We call it the water ox. It's the one with the 2 knives, the double-edged sword, we'll call it, because that's what we currently have, taking 1 big footstep. And this tells me he was a patriarch. In one regard, right? The order of the patriarchs. Okay, so there's the cross, 110. So I got confused. Enclosure doesn't surprise me. This is garden. We've got enclosure. So earth is the plus or minus. I thought it was scholar. We got enclosure. We got a mouth, which kind of looks like enclosure, but it's supposed to be mouth. We got this right square thing again, and we got this bend, but it's at a different angle. So earth and scholar apparently aren't the same thing. So there's earth. And if I decompose earth, I'm back to 10. But if I do a difference comparison of those, they're not the same letter. And I think I'm going to stop there. So I've typed up some things, some ideas about the calendar and exactly what I would propose. I'm not going to include the XLS file because it's not super important to figure it out. And I think I'll stop there, and then I'll do another video on this other stuff. So the twilight, you have degrees of rotation that you need to think about. You would basically utilize some of the knowledge that Islam uses for their prayers. The hours of the night are 18, the hours of the day are 18. It's tied to ancient Hebrew, understanding ancient Islam as well. But the phases or hours of the night would be unequal because it's a function of the light. And when it's dark, you may have a function that's tied to when the moon came out or when the stars came out or whatever. The vigil of night, Ramadan, they focus on. And then the day, I think, would be 18 equal hours. Aloha. Something happened to my voice. Shalom.